Gentlemen, we have called you together to inform you that we are going to overthrow the United States government. Do you still think that jet fuel brought down the World Trade Center? Does anybody else see a problem here? If the government has nothing to hide, why are they so afraid to answer a few questions? This story does not add up.
Hold out that pack of cigarettes! Don't be afraid! Stand very still! Stand still!
Told you it was off.
Move over by the car! Quick, before you pass out!
We're in a very, very interesting world, Alex, and you know that this is a time that's been prophesized by indigenous cultures around the world as a time of shaking up, of turmoil, and a time when people are going to wake up more, and we really are waking up, and we have to expect that there's going to be a pushback by the status quo. They're going to do everything they can to stop this turnaround from happening.
Well said. Just briefly, the Coney 2012 people, we just learned, have released their big part 2, and I'm attacked in it for pointing out that this was being used by the State Department to try to launch wars in Africa. And the same thing's happening in Uganda, in the past. This is happening now. I'm not saying the Lord's Resistance Army is good. They haven't been seen in years. There's these calls to go into Sudan and start a war. And my point is they get these well-meaning people involved thinking backing military intervention is for the good. But I never see the State Department get behind something, John, for the good generally. It's always for special interest. But they'll use the left now. I'm seeing some of the left call for war as if it's humanitarian.
Yeah, we're seeing that in Mali, too. But, the threat of war is good for business. Unfortunately, our economy is to a very large degree based on the military. And I can't believe that anybody really wants us to go to another war with Iran. I mean, my God, Iran can close down the Straits of Hormuz and shut off more than 20% of the world's oil supplies. We don't want war with them, and I don't think most of the big industries do either. But they want the threat of war. Because as long as you've got that threat of war hanging over you, everybody's buying weapons and security.
Well, what about Libya? I mean, I'm not a fan of Gaddafi, but he was a stabilizer. He'd come in out of the cold. They've put al-Qaeda in charge now.
Yeah, well, we remember that Gaddafi, was opposed to the dollar, to the central bank, the Federal Reserve, our central bank. And he was threatening to create a new exchange for oil that would not be paid for in dollars, but would be paid for in what he called the gold dinar. He had a pretty big gold supply.
Stay there. I want to hear about why they went after him for that. Final segment with John Perkins, author of Hoodwinked, and, of course, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Amazing person. We'll also give you his website when we come back. I'm Alex Jones of Infowars.com. And, of course, we're also streaming video. You keep hearing me talking about video at prisonplanet.tv. On the front page of Infowars.com, the war on prosperity is calling you. Enlist in the IRS. Incredible graphic. Bill allows IRS to deny Americans right to travel, and it looks like it's going to pass. It's passed the Senate. It's now going to the House. I mean, let me tell you, this has always been the plan. Arizona law, hot on the trail of Obama's documents. Ron Paul continues to draw huge crowds, but media blackout. More furious. U.S. soldiers trafficked arms, drugs to DEA agents. That's at Infowars.com. Sarkozy arrests dozens of Islamicists in raids before election to look tough. They staged that whole deal, folks. After huge ammo buy, DHS purchases bulletproof resistant booths for highway checkpoints. We've got a big article coming out about this professor saying if you question man-made climate change and paying Al Gore money, basically, you should be put in a mental ward. Now we found more of her writings. End democracy. Okay, that article's coming out. See how fast they pull that off there. John Perkins, whose website is johnperkins.org. You can sign up there and get his free newsletter at johnperkins.org. You can also sign up at infowars.com, halfway down to our free newsletter. John, finish up with Gaddafi, because that's a good model. I mean, love him or hate him, he was actually building up Africa, and he was not playing ball with the banker boys.
He certainly was not playing ball with the banker boys. He's made the same mistake, if you want to call it that, as Saddam Hussein, and the Iranians are poising for the same thing today, and that is to say, I'm going to bring the dollar down. Basically, he said, there's no reason why we can only trade oil for U.S. dollars. And he was recommending that African nations and other Muslim and Middle East nations buy oil and sell oil for the gold dinar, which was a currency that he basically created. He had a huge gold supply to back it up in his own country. And now we don't take kindly to any infringement upon the Federal Reserve or the U.S. dollar. And I think, frankly, that's the big reason why we went after him when we did.
And, I always say that, too. But, I mean, you're saying it. We say we. And I guess it is we, because we let our government turn into this with corporations. But more and more, they just ignore the people's will. The American people don't like what's happening. I mean, Congress has a 9% approval rating. I think we just need to recognize this government and these corporations do not have our best interest at heart and really are the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. It isn't really we, it's they. But we are part of it, and we've got to turn it around. We've got to realize, though, that the government really isn't all that important. The government's run by the big corporations. But ultimately, we do have control over these corporations. We got rid of apartheid in South Africa back when I was in college by boycotting companies that supported it. We get corporations to clean up terribly polluted rivers in this country and open their doors wider to women and minorities. We do have a lot of power over this if we just exercise it. We have to do it, though. We have to demand that these corporations turn things around, or we won't buy from them. We won't support them.
What do you think of how they're trying to rebrand war now under left cover, because it's been discredited under the right, where, we're going to aid Syria, the rebels, and they're calling them protesters when they're arming people to try to overthrow them?
Yeah, well, it's just another misuse of words, and we hear that all the time. It's always there for war and dictators support dictators. It was shocking to me that when Mubarak fell in Egypt, that a huge percentage of the American people thought he was a democratically elected president. He's been a totalitarian dictator backed up by our CIA for decades.
Absolutely. John Perkins, thank you for the time today.
My pleasure, Alex. Keep up your good work.
Thank you, sir. The one area that I didn't properly cover today is really big right now. We covered it days ago, but now it's blown up. Obama said, hey, forget Congress. I'll launch wars if I want to. Go to Hades. But now he said to the Supreme Court, because the word is they're going to rule against his plan. And so he said, they don't count. I can do whatever I want. This has turned into a big deal and is really flipping people out right now. Now, this may be a ruse where they're really going to rule for it. Who knows?
Random House Audio presents Hoodwinked. An economic hitman reveals why the world financial markets imploded and what we need to do to remake them. By John Perkins. Read for you by David Ackroyd. Introduction. I was an economic hitman, EHM, part of an elite corps of modern-day hired guns who promote the interests of big corporations and certain sectors of the U.S. government. I had a fancy title, Chief Economist, and a staff of highly qualified economists, management consultants, and financial analysts who produced impressive reports that appeared legitimate. But my real job was to deceive and plunder the Third World. Although we EHMs work in many ways, our most common task is to identify countries with resources our corporations covet. Then we seduce, bribe, and extort their leaders into exploiting their own people, accepting loans the countries can never repay, privatizing their national assets, legalizing the destruction of fragile environments, and finally, selling those coveted resources to our corporations at bargain prices. When the leaders resist, they are overthrown or assassinated by CIA-sponsored jackals. We were so successful in the Third World that our bosses directed us to implement similar strategies in the United States and across the rest of the planet. The result is an unsustainable form of capitalism that is the driving force behind the current economic crisis. Despite temporary recoveries, this crisis is the leading edge of a global tsunami. I jotted down those words while my Iceland Air 757 landed very early in the morning at Reykjavik on March 5, 2009, after an exhausting all-night flight from Florida. Staring out into the blackness, I suddenly had the sensation that I was back in the late 1800s, arriving by stagecoach in an old West boom town, perhaps Tombstone, Arizona, or Deadwood, South Dakota, and that the boom town's collapse was just another symptom that the tsunami was building energy. Considered a poor, underdeveloped, and distant cousin to Europe until recently, Iceland's economy had suddenly exploded, rising to the rank of the planet's third wealthiest nation per capita on the World Bank's 2007 list. Reykjavik had mushroomed into a boomtown where people amassed fortunes overnight. Celebrities, gamblers, con artists, and economic hitmen arrived in droves. Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, and most of the other big Wall Street firms dispatched their necktied armies. Applying a model similar to that used to exploit Indonesia, Nigeria, Colombia, and all the countries whose oil or other precious natural resources propelled them into instant materialism, men and women with my old job convinced individuals and the government to mortgage to the hilt. People embarked on a made-for-Hollywood buying spree. They purchased Miami mansions, Beverly Hills condos, British department stores, Danish airlines, Bentleys and Rolls-Royces, Norwegian power plants, and even an English soccer team. In 2007, the country's citizens possessed approximately 50 times more foreign assets than they had in 2002. Iceland's stock market skyrocketed by a multiple of 9 from 2003 to 2007, while the U.S. market merely doubled. Reykjavik's real estate prices tripled. The average family's wealth grew by 3 times over a period of 3 years. The raw material for Iceland's boom, its gold, was hydroelectric and geothermal power. The glaciers, rivers, volcanoes, and underground hot springs appeared to offer limitless amounts of energy. Because this resource cannot be boxed or barreled, it had to be exploited on site. The biggest of the big energy users, the aluminum companies, came to Iceland in the late 1960s. During the next 4 decades, as global aluminum demand soared, they convinced Iceland's leaders to construct power plants for the sole purpose of energizing foreign-owned smelters. Alcoa made an offer that would place Iceland on the map, a deal to build a mammoth water-to-aluminum complex in the remote north. All Iceland had to do was commit to a very large loan, collateralized by the revenues anticipated from the sale of kilowatt hours, and hire foreign corporations to build a dam and power plant to generate over 600 megawatts to fire just this one smelter, compared to the 300 megawatts used by all the people of Iceland. Of course, it was not quite that simple. Scientists discovered that the dam site straddled an earthquake fault line, and that the area to be flooded, about the size of Manhattan, in a country slightly smaller than Kentucky, contained rare ecosystems. The people looked the other way while their government waived environmental laws and issued special condition construction permits. In June 2007, Alcoa inaugurated its aluminum factory, built by the United States Bechtel Corporation. The new factory was slated to produce 346,000 metric tons of aluminum per year, which was 10 times the capacity of the country's first plant. The people celebrated. That is, until they learned that their utility company was hemorrhaging tens of thousands of dollars every hour that Alcoa ran its equipment. On October 6, 2008, the unheard of happened. Iceland's banks, which had grown to many times the size of the country's national economy, collapsed.